feel like this is almost like 96 hours in a casino kind of vibe to it. So
yeah.
Welcome into the NFL on Fox podcast. I'm Dave Helman, and Combine Week rolls along here. Actually, the Combine itself, the thing that we know it for, actually now finally starts. It's Thursday. NFL teams, coaches, prospects have all been in Indianapolis since Monday at this point. But the good stuff finally starts today. The on-field workouts begin at Lucas Oil Stadium in Indianapolis today. It starts with defensive linemen and linebackers going through their position drills. The money day, it's going to be Saturday. That's when all the big dudes go, the quarterbacks, the receivers, the running backs, the sexy positions will all work out, show you what they've got. So if you're around this weekend, Saturday is the day to know if you want to flip on the TV and check it out. We've got so much about that. There's so much news coming out of the Combine. There's a lot to get to. But in terms of the prospects themselves, we actually have our good buddy Bruce Feldman of The Athletic dropping by today to just kind of give us a primer on what to expect. Who's working out, who's not working out, what that means, who might surprise us, who might put up a freaky workout and make themselves some money. All that good stuff coming later in the show with Bruce Feldman. You're going to want to give that a listen. If I don't say it a million times already, going to make sure you subscribe to the show. Follow us on social at NFL on Fox Pod. All of the good apps that you love so much, you can find us there. Spotify, Apple Podcasts. We got so much more coverage coming out of the Combine next week. Stuff runs all the way till Sunday. So even next week, I'm sure we'll have some Combine news and information coming out. But for the time being, we're still in the thick of this thing. Coaches, execs still talking in Indianapolis at the same time that all of this draft prep is going on. So without further ado, I teased we're going to talk to Bruce Feldman about the actual prospects. Yes, I did say that. So let's get to the news because there's plenty of it coming out of Indianapolis. And the top one I love because we spend so much time scrutinizing NFL players and even and coaches as well. It's fun when you get a chance to scrutinize owners. That is the top news right now, is that the NFLPA released its second annual NFL report cards. Basically, if you're not familiar with this, the NFLPA for the last 2 years, they've polled their members. So the 1,700 some odd active members of the NFL, the players, polled by the NFLPA about various things around their organization, right? Like how teams treat their players, what they make them pay for, what travel accommodations are like when you go on the road, how is the facility, how's the weight room, how's the cafeteria, how do you treat my family, all that good stuff. And they just let guys vote and tell them what they thought very honestly. And I love this tweet from JJ Watt because I've spent a lot of time in NFL locker rooms and I agree with JJ. Players don't always take things super seriously. Like when they vote on those top 100 players lists or when they vote on the Pro Bowl, there are a lot of players that treat it like a joke. They don't treat this like a joke. They take this very seriously because it is a chance to give honest feedback. And if we're being real, it's a chance to shame your team into changing things about the way it goes inside these buildings. And my biggest takeaway, again, we only have 2 years worth of data. This is only the second time that they've done this. And by the way, you can go to NFLPA.com if you want to see the nitty gritty of all 32 teams and how well or poorly they did. It's a very fun read. Please go give it a look. But the big thing to me is that shaming NFL owners works. Nothing jumps out to me more than the Arizona Cardinals, who moved up 5 spots this year from 31 overall to 27 overall. NFL owners don't like for it to get out that they're cheap or unwilling to spend or that their facility sucks. So last year, Arizona finishes 31st overall. It comes out that they charge players for dinner. You know, if you were after hours at the facility working out and you want a meal, the Cardinals are going to charge you for it. They changed that, and they replaced the flooring in their weight room. So this stuff does work. And like I said, it's in a league where there's so much scrutiny on the players, the coaches, even the executives. Not a lot of opportunity to hold owners accountable, and this feels like one of them. I'm guessing the effects of this are going to continue to be felt. The thing that's getting passed around social media this year is that the LA Chargers, pardon the pun, charge for game day daycare. If you're a Chargers player and you've got to drop your kid off to play a game, the reason you're employed by the team, they charge you $75 for your first kid and $50 for any kid after that. Which, I mean, I get it. NFL players make a lot of money, but that's just a crappy look. Like literally your whole job is to be available for those 8 to 10 hours on a Sunday to play the game. And you're going to charge me to watch my kid? And you're an organization that's building a $270 million facility in the LA area? No, it's cheap. And it's also not the type of thing that endears itself to potential free agents. That's the other thing. You want to make yourself appealing to guys when they have the freedom and the ability to choose where they go. You don't want to be at the bottom of these lists. Miami and Minnesota have been at the top for 2 years. The word from the NFLPA is that they're in a class of their own. I think stuff like that matters to players. One more thing before we move on. It is worth noting, on-field success doesn't necessarily guarantee you anything in these rankings. I was a little flabbergasted to see the Kansas City Chiefs very predictably voted Andy Reid the best coach in the NFL. The highest percentage of his players love him, which is not surprising. But the Chiefs still finished 31st of 32 in overall polling. Just D's and F's all over the place for the Kansas City Chiefs. The NFLPA citing things like the team's failure to overhaul its locker room. Sounds like team owner Clark Hunt promised some renovations and didn't deliver on it. So yeah, that stuff matters. Even if you're racking up Super Bowls, you got to take care of the players or you're going to get a big fat F in the report cards. I love it. I love it. Like I said, it's a rare instance to hold billionaires accountable, even in the smallest way. I think it's good stuff. I hope they keep doing this for a long time to come. Let's keep the news pushing, and let's keep the Chiefs in the news, which is strange. Usually when you win a Super Bowl, you just kind of disappear into the background. Like February and March is for the losers, right? It's for everybody that's trying to get better, everybody chasing the champs. But the Kansas City Chiefs are squarely in the news cycle this week. Coming up after the report cards is the news that, depending on who you ask, either Chiefs cornerback L'Jarius Sneed has been franchise tagged or he will be franchise tagged soon. It's kind of irrelevant because the Chiefs are making it known right now he will be tagged if a long-term deal hasn't been agreed to. Sneed, obviously, one of the best cornerbacks in the game last year, one of the sneaky best parts of their team and a big piece of that defense that helped win them that championship. Sneed is now guaranteed a salary of $19.8 million in 2024. But what's more interesting than that is that the Chiefs have granted him permission to seek a trade if he can. Now, I think that's big news. 27-year-old cornerback, one of the two best available in this year's or was available in this year's free agent class, along with Chicago's Jalen Johnson. If you're talking about lockdown, staple cornerstone guys, a guy that you can build a secondary and a defense around, Sneed's just one of two in this year's free agent class. I don't have a hard time believing the Chiefs could fetch potentially as much as a first-round pick for this guy's services the way he's been playing the last couple years. I'm curious, with what Patrick Mahomes costs against their cap, with aging contracts like Travis Kelce, with the need to try to find a way to re-sign a guy like Chris Jones, if somebody's willing to bite, maybe the Chiefs are willing to part ways and have that extra draft capital to work with. We'll see where it goes, but Sneed either is tagged or will be tagged, and we'll see where it goes from here for one of the best young corners in football. Of course, there's two levels to this. Like I said, the Chiefs are all over the news this week because at the same time this news is coming out, Kansas City announces they've released receiver Marquez Valdez-Scantling, MVS, freed up $12 million against their salary cap in the process. A completely unsurprising move. MVS was a hero in the playoffs. He's been a hero for the Chiefs in 2 straight playoffs, but 21 catches, 1 touchdown in the regular season last year, was tied to so many missed opportunities. The drop against Philadelphia sticks out in my mind even still. The usage in the regular season does not justify the cap hit. He signed a $30 million contract a couple years ago. So the Chiefs release him. They save $12 million against the cap. And now, even with all those problems we just mentioned, they got $17 million in salary cap space, and they can still free up even more. Remember, earlier this week, we talked about the salary cap being higher than anybody anticipated at $255 million. With this savings and then some other moves they could do to free up even more space, whether that's restructures or even more releases, it's not out of the realm of possibility the Chiefs could free up enough money to at least attempt to keep both L'Jarius Sneed and Chris Jones, the all-pro, all-world defensive tackle. Easier said than done. I don't know if it happens, but the fact that it's even possible is remarkable, because I think for weeks we've been saying the Chiefs have got to choose one or the other. One of these guys won't be here in 2024. But now I'm thinking it's at least possible. And man, what a coup that would be for a team that just won its 2nd straight Super Bowl. We'll see where that goes. I can't believe at the end of February we dedicate that much of the show to the Super Bowl champs when there's so many other teams to get to. I mentioned Bears cornerback Jalen Johnson a minute ago. Friend of the podcast, was gracious enough to drop by at the start of the offseason. He's going to be a very rich man one way or the other very soon. Bears general manager Ryan Poles said on Tuesday Chicago is in the process of re-signing their all-pro cornerback, and they would prefer not to use the tag, which everybody would prefer not to use the tag. The problem is you only have so much time with which to apply it, and Jalen Johnson has played well enough to be at the top of the cornerback market. So if I'm doing basic math, Ryan Poles has about a week to get a deal done with a guy who's going to be asking for in excess of $20 million a year, if I had to guess. If the tag is worth 19.8, so the floor of your salary, if you're a franchise tag player, is 19.8. Yeah, I would assume Jalen Johnson's going to be asking for 20 plus, and you've got about a week to get it done. I'm going to step out on a limb and say that sounds like a tall order. But either way, much like L'Jarius Sneed, one way or the other, Jalen Johnson will be in Chicago either as a tagged player or as an extended player, and he's going to have a lot of cheese in about a week's time. Like I said, one way or the other, we'll see where that goes as well. But it doesn't sound like either of the top 2 cornerbacks in this year's free agent class are going anywhere. Same situation, different position. Everything I just said about Jalen Johnson and L'Jarius Sneed, you can apply to Colts wide receiver Michael Pittman Jr. Indianapolis general manager Chris Ballard said this week he hopes to re-sign Pittman after his 1,100-yard season in 2023. One more time, they've got until March 5th to get a deal done. If they don't, go ahead and assume the Colts will tag Pittman. I do think he's an interesting case, though, because look, this is a league with so many superstar wide receivers, so many guys worthy of big paydays. And I think Pittman, and I think most people would agree with this, Pittman hovers right around the borderline between wide receiver 1 and wide receiver 2. Not a completely dissimilar situation to T. Higgins in Cincinnati, where you say, yeah, this guy's really good. Is he as good as a Justin Jefferson, a Jamar Chase, a CD Lamb? These guys that are going to command contracts at the very top of the market. The negotiation is going to start at $21.8 million because that's the tag number for a wide receiver. So that's where it starts for Pittman if they tag him. My question is, how much higher is Indianapolis willing to go? That is what we will see here over the next week, or even in the months to come if they do wind up having to tag him. As usual, my guess is any team that is negotiating right now they're almost always going to have to use the tag, because if you're a player and you know that you are 2 weeks away from all 32 teams having a chance to bid on you, you would have to get a hell of an offer to want to avoid that, right? Like you want as many people bidding on your services as possible. So I have a feeling all of these guys will wind up tagged eventually. We'll see where it all goes. One last bit of news, and that is that the Jets have granted permission to Zach Wilson to seek a trade, the former number 2 overall pick, the starter and then backup and then starter and then backup. Yeah, you know the whole drill with Zach Wilson. He has permission to seek a trade out of New York. I'm sure a fresh start would be great for him. With all due respect, I wonder what Zach Wilson might be able to command in a trade. You're probably talking about 2 teams swapping late round picks. Like, hey, turn our 7th round pick into a 6th round pick and you can have Zach Wilson, et cetera, et cetera. I would like to see him in a new place, especially knowing Aaron Rodgers is coming back. He doesn't have a path to the starting job unless another injury happens. I'd like to see him get a shot somewhere else. Just not sure what somebody else is going to be willing to offer. Something else to keep an eye on. And I think that's all of our news. It's always busy when every team is in Indianapolis just spouting off developments about contracts and everything else. I think we covered just about everything. So now, without further ado, let's get to the actual reason why people go to the combine. That's this year's crop of rookie prospects that are going to be testing at Lucas Oil Stadium. And who better to talk about rookies, incoming rookies, than somebody that covers the college game and somebody that knows as much about the college game as our buddy Bruce Feldman. He was gracious enough to check in from Indianapolis about this week's workouts and who we need to know heading into the weekend.
All right, Bruce, to start this off, I'll just speak candidly. I'm pretty jealous. Personally, as somebody who's covered the combine plenty of times, I think it's one of the most fun, most useful weeks of the year, particularly from a reporter's perspective. Just the networking you can do, the information that you can glean, whether it's from agents, players, coaches, you name it. I think it's incredibly valuable. So I'm curious from your perspective, what is this week like? And as we go through this year's combine week, what are you learning out there in Indianapolis?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, as a reporter, it is a great time to network. So I red-eyed in here, took a red-eye out of LA Sunday night, got in at like 6 a.m., was able to nap for 2 hours. And I feel like this is almost like 96 hours in a casino kind of vibe to it. So
yeah.
You don't go outside much. There's sky bridges. Like I happened to go outside right before I came in where I guess there was a tornado in the area and it definitely felt like the winds are blowing you all over the place. So, but you see a lot of people in the sky bridges and around and in bars and restaurants. And, it's a great place to reconnect with people, especially for me, knowing a lot of coaches who were in college or now in the NFL. That's really a big part of why I do this trip every year. And it's hard to schedule things because you constantly feel like you're late to something because you don't know who you're going to run into, but you know you're going to run into somebody. And that's kind of how it is. And it's good for me also as a guy who covered college football. You know, you see players that you had covered for a couple of years and now here they're kind of being herded through the process as it is. So it's a really interesting dynamic.
And I think I can hear my producers listening to this too, it's a weird thing to reconcile because I mean, the idea is to produce content, right? But at the same time, I think a lot of the value of the combine is stuff that maybe won't come to light for weeks or months, or in some cases, maybe even years. Just some of these conversations you can have about whether it's strategizing, whether it's about contracts. I think it gets undersold a little bit. Just the context you can glean that maybe isn't going to be a story this week.
Yeah, I agree. And it's so much so, especially in my case, it's really about how strong are the relationships you have. And a lot of that happens where you reconnect with people or you just, to build bonds with people maybe on the surface, and then you have longer conversations or, get drinks with. It's just a much better way, for me as a writer and as a reporter, like these are connections that I can tap into over the course of the year. And so whether the story comes out 4 days from now or 3 months from now, or if I'm writing something about, I do a lot of stuff for The Athletic about covering the draft and the perspective I can get from people who are in the scouting process or in the coaching process to be able to have them and to have that access, that's what's most valuable to me.
So let's jump into this year's actual crop of players. The workouts are beginning late in the week. They go through the weekend, every position group, all these big name players. But what I want to start with, and I don't want to overreact to it too much, because I think it's normal to hear guys, especially guys at the top of the draft, opt out of the workouts and things like that. And that it's a big storyline this week. Caleb Williams, QB1 out of USC, Drake May out of UNC, Jaden Daniels, the Heisman Trophy winner. None of these guys expected to work out at the combine. But then the thing that makes this extra interesting to me is what we're hearing about Marvin Harrison Jr., the all-world receiver out of Ohio State, widely expected to be a top 3-5 pick. He's not doing the combine. He's maybe not even doing a pro day. And I just wonder, like, over the last, 10, 15 years, people have really embraced the value of the combine. I think people turn up their nose a lot less than they used to about what these drills can do for you. But now I wonder if we're seeing a switch back to the other side, where it's like, these guys are training for months and months at a time to run a 40-yard dash or do whatever position-specific drill it is. And does it seem like maybe we're just switching back to like, hey, no, let's focus on football and not get too wrapped up in what's happening here in Indianapolis?
Yeah, I think there's definitely a lot about, ultimately it comes back to what people see on film or what they glean in their meetings individually with players. The other thing that I think is a component of this also is right now with the technology it is with GPS tracking data, and you can tell how fast somebody's running, on a play in game or certainly in practice. A lot of those, that's not just on the film, it's quantifiable. And some of the technology, the way they can manage it and not spin it, but kind of gauge certain things from it, I think, can be more valuable than how fast somebody is on a straight line for 40 yards. And obviously there's certain tests that different coaches, depending on which position they're talking about, feel are more valuable. I mean, is a 10-yard split more valuable for an offensive lineman than a 40-yard, obviously, but those numbers are still, I think because there's some form of a gauge for somebody to compare it from generation to generation. I don't know how much anybody's going to take off of, like I said, if you have a guard who's running a certain time in the 40, I think there's probably other metrics that they would say are more valuable. I think in terms of the quarterbacks, like Marvin Harrison Jr. is interesting. He's been a guy who's been on my freaks list the last couple of years. He's in the top 3. Whether if he ran 4.43 as opposed to 4.39, I don't think anybody looked at him any differently. They've had a lot of film on him. I think people, have also a deep reservoir of information from that Ohio State position room and the guys who've come from there. So, whether it's Brian Hartline's word on him or Ryan Day's word on him, they have a lot of context compared to Garrett Wilson, Chris Olave, Terry McLaurin. There's a bunch of dudes who come through there. It's not like one of the things you hear a lot in evaluation is, how does this coach know what a great one is if he's never had a great one? But the flip side is when some of these guys have, and they can give you quantified, perspective on it, I think it definitely adds something.
Yeah, I would guess Brian Hartline, working at Ohio State, knows a thing or two about what a great wide receiver looks like here over the last few years. And I think it's a valid point too. When we talk about shifts in attitude, I think you're talking about like the top 1% of players. Like, to your point, Marvin Harrison's going to get drafted in the top 10 no matter what he does, barring a catastrophe. So I am curious, and so many of these guys still do have so much to prove, and you can take it in any direction you want. I mean, I think quarterbacks are going to get a lot of the attention, but even maybe if it's, this stacked receiver class, is there a player or players that have even more to gain, maybe, when you consider that some of the biggest names in this draft cycle aren't expected to do a lot on the field?
I think my number one freaks list guy here is Chop Robinson from Penn State. And he's a guy who will test exceptionally well. I mean, there's a lot of comparisons physically to Micah Parsons. And going into the year, a lot of people looked at him as a top 15 caliber pick, whereas coming out of the season, I think there's some questions. I don't want to say some doubts, but is he a first round pick? Is he a mid second? Where is he? If he comes into Indy and does what not only he thinks he's going to do, but some of the people who've been around him in the training process over the last couple of weeks, who I've talked to, think he's going to put up absurd numbers. I think he's going to be hard to pass up in the first round. If he's 6'3", 250, 255, and he's running a 4.4 40 and broad jumping 11 feet and vertical jumping 40 inches, guys like that, and there's definitely stuff on film. Consistency is a question mark, but there's definitely stuff on film where you're like, okay, that matches the numbers. Now what happens? He could be an impact guy in that way. And I think if he proves that he is that special athletically, traits wise, I think he has a chance to really probably jump up from where a lot of people think he may go now.
So that's Chop Robinson out of Penn State, if you're not familiar. And I was going to get to it. You've mentioned it a couple times. If you're an NFL fan listening to this podcast, I highly encourage you to go check out Bruce's Freaks List. It is one of the more legendary pieces of content in the football world. I think maybe particularly in college football, obviously, because that's when you talk about these guys. But it is so incredibly fun at this time of year when these guys are going to the NFL to go and look back at your list. And especially, you've noted before, like, you've been doing this long enough that you can kind of see these guys progress from, like a true freshman that you're hearing about from coaches and trainers to a guy that's about to be a first round pick. So for starters, before I ask you about some specific players, how has that process been where this has kind of taken on a life of its own, I guess, and where you're seeing guys over multiple years progress in these categories?
Yeah, it's come on 20 years that I've been doing it. And it really has evolved in maybe the last 8 years. So I don't know, about 7 or 8 years ago, I started working as a sideline reporter for Fox. And before the games, you're talking to coaches to get prepared for your broadcast. But the other people who are on the field right before a college game are NFL scouts. And a bunch of them over the years would come up to me and talk to me about the Freaks List. And it surprised me how it was in the grassroots of, but also inside the NFL world. And over time, I realized, these guys could be really good resources for me. And so I started tapping into them about especially when it came to smaller school, because a lot of the games we're doing, it's, Big 10, Pac-12, Big 12, but there's a whole other group of players who end up coming into the NFL scouting process who maybe aren't just group of 5 players, maybe they're FCS players, maybe they're Division II players. And a lot of those guys have some intel on that. And so I really cultivated that aspect of it. And it just really took off in the last few years as I would hear from so many people about the first time they've ever heard of these guys was via the Freaks List. And a lot of what I get is from, strength coaches and trainers. And there was a time where you'd hear so much skepticism about, no way, this guy's running this. And then they go to Indy a year later or 2 years later, and they not only would match it, some of them would exceed it because now they were training for the shuttle. They were training for the broad jump. And I think it was kind of eye-opening for a lot of people. And for me, I certainly knew, okay, who do I have? Who's backed it up and who has the biggest track record? Where there may be a handful of schools where I'm like, okay, those guys their players are doing impressive, but they're not quite where they were according to their schools. And it was, so you just definitely have a perspective on it from doing it for so long and who you really trust.
Okay, so you gave us Chop out of Penn State on the defensive side of the ball. I'd love to just kind of go down the list a little bit and pick your brain about some guys who could make some money this week at the NFL Combine. So if Chop Robinson on the defensive side of the ball, what about an offensive player who could really jump out and who really has a lot to gain this week?
I think that when you get into this week, this is such a deep crop of receivers. Obviously, we talked about Marvin, Rome Odunze, who has a legit track background when he was a high school, athlete in Las Vegas before he went. I think there's there's the receiver group is deep, and then I think you get into a lot of guys on the defensive side of the ball. But another receiver who I think will be fascinating to watch is Roman Wilson from Michigan. He was the Wolverines by far their top target. He is very explosive, but he's not very big. He's 6 feet and 180 some pounds. He had a really strong week of practice at the Senior Bowl. His shuttle numbers are remarkably fast, and we're going to see if he can match the numbers that Ben Herbert, the Michigan strength coach, not only told me, but he also sent me like a lot of videos of some of the stuff those guys did in training. He would be off the charts in how he is timed relative to some of the guys who've come through the combine. The other thing on him is they told me he ran a 4.3 340, which is obviously blazing fast last offseason.
Yes.
But he did it out of a 2-point stance. And if you watch the combine over the years, nobody runs out of a 2-point stance. They all run out of they're down on the ground and ready to burst out. So last year, DJ Turner, who was a really fast Michigan defensive back, ran 4.28 out of a 2-point stance. He actually went to the combine and ran 4.26. So I'm not saying that Roman Wilson, by the same math, will then go 4.31, but if they had him at 4.33 out of a 2-point stance, don't be surprised if he ends up in the 4.2s.
Which I think it's been 6 or 7 years since we've had a new best time in the 40-yard dash. That'll definitely be something to watch. What about, and I think about Jordan Davis, the Georgia defensive tackle, when I asked this question. Obviously, there was so much intrigue around a guy that big moving the way that he can. Is there somebody like that this year who maybe on Saturday afternoon, I'm going to look at my phone and say, holy hell, he did what?
Not quite Jordan Davis big, but watch out for Byron Murphy from Texas. He's a 300-pounder. I heard he's going to run in the 4.8s. He's really explosive, and his film is really good. He makes a lot of plays, very disruptive. There are certain guys there's bigger guys who may run in that ballpark, but don't be surprised if he's at 4.80. He is that explosive. And again, like I said, he's really disruptive too. He's just not a big defensive tackle.
All right, I'll put you on the spot a little bit. Obviously, Byron Murphy, Texas, and Roman Wilson, Michigan. These are guys that played in the college football playoff. They're on these major programs. Is there a guy, and I'm putting you on the spot because if you knew the answer, you could take it to Vegas, but is there a guy who is way more under the radar who might be an NFL household name by the time the combine's over?
Yes. This is Maction. This is from Toledo. Quinion Mitchell. He's a cornerback. He's a really good player. And he is, he had 4 picks in a game and 2 pick sixes 2 years ago. He was on my freaks list, is super fast. I was told by the guys training him, don't be surprised if Quinion Mitchell, who's not a small corner, he's a solid 6 feet, 195, that he may run in the low 4.3s. He might even get in the 4.2s. I mean, he is blazing fast. And he's also really strong. I mean, for a cornerback to bench 225 21 times, and that was a year ago. I mean, now he's training for the combine. I think he's a guy who will light this up. He has really good film. He's a really good man-to-man corner. The Toledo coaches love him. I think he will be. Devin Witherspoon blew up last year, not so much because of the combine, because he wasn't working out, but he was the guy who a lot of buzz came out of it because people started talking to people going, yeah, the Illinois corner was shutting people down. This guy, I think, is like that, but he's going to actually work out here, and I think he will generate even more buzz.
Another really good point is the combine is valuable because people like yourself and plenty of other reporters, you get into these bars and restaurants with coaches and scouts, and they're like, yeah. The guy that's on your mock draft is cool, but this is the guy. This is the guy you need to be talking about. So that's definitely something to watch. All right, Bruce, one last one for you. And I think it's about what I think is maybe the most interesting prospect in this draft. And that is the quarterback of the reigning national champ Michigan Wolverines, JJ McCarthy. And I'm so fascinated by the story here because, I mean, look, the winning speaks for itself. The talent speaks for itself. But the debate comes in with what Michigan asked of its quarterback last year. Clearly, he was good enough to win a national championship. But I also think there's a lot of people that are going to say, well, I don't know that the tape stacks up with what some of these other prospects have done. You're as plugged in as anybody. You see as much college football as anybody. What do you make of JJ McCarthy and where he might eventually wind up in this draft?
I like JJ as a first round quarterback. I don't know if he's a top 10 quarterback, but the stuff that we've seen from him, he's a really good athlete. He can really run. He throws on the run really well. That translates. He's really competitive. He is a good leader. He's a winner. You see that. Like I think back to some of my experiences around him. We did a lot of Michigan games. I also, wrote a lot about Michigan. And I remembered in the 2022 season, a few weeks before they were going to play Ohio State. Remember, they'd beaten Ohio State once at that point, and it was in a snowy game, and it was in Ann Arbor. And I remember JJ gave me a quote, which was very confident about what they, how the rivalry had turned, and now that they're, it's going to keep beating them down, kind of thing. And after I got off the phone, I was like, "Ooh, that's going to be bulletin board material." And I was like, I could see that blowing up in JJ's face because the game was in Columbus, and everybody was like, "Here comes payback." And last year was a fluke. Well, what happened was Blake Corum was hurt, and Donovan Edwards, even though he played really well, he was banged up in the game, was playing with the soft cast on his hand. JJ made some big throws and led that team, and they won that game going away. And they've only built off that. I think, he's younger than some of these quarterbacks, but I think he had to do a lot of stuff that Michigan requires of its quarterback footwork wise. That is not easy for a lot of guys to come in and learn all that they ask their quarterback to do in that offense. I think he's really smart. The other thing that will be interesting is from talking to some NFL coaches here in Indy, one concern I got from one of the guys was, they think almost he throws every ball kind of the same, where you're wondering, does he layer this? Can he do that? There's like a lot of different pitches that they sometimes want to see. This particular coach was like, I didn't see enough of that. So we'll see where that goes. After, seeing him for a couple of years and seeing his development and seeing kind of how he approaches this, I think JJ McCarthy will be a good NFL quarterback. I just don't know if he's going to be a good NFL quarterback. If he, so much depends on what the situation he goes into.
Sure.
But I really like him. And I think there's a lot to like about him, not just athletically, but intangibles wise.
I think that's what makes it so interesting too, is assuming he's not the number 1 or number 2 overall pick. Now the whole league is up for grabs. I mean, the Kansas City Chiefs, obviously that's where everybody goes when you talk about Patrick Mahomes and the infrastructure that was around him. It'll be fascinating to see what caliber of team winds up with JJ McCarthy, what caliber of coaching staff. I can't wait to see it, but just the range of outcomes make it very interesting for me. We'll see how it plays out. Bruce, I appreciate the time. I know how busy it gets in Indianapolis at combine time. So for you to take the time, I deeply appreciate it, man. Have a good rest of your week.
My pleasure. You too. Thanks for having me.
Thanks again to Bruce for stopping by. Thanks for every team in the NFL for peppering us with news to keep the offseason going. That does it for the show. That does it for the week. We will be back on Tuesday to update everything coming out of the combine and whatever other news stories are on the way. Positive there will be something, so keep it locked in here. Make sure you're following us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, subscribe to the YouTube channel. You know the drill. We're here all the time. I'll catch y'all next week.